I want to thank you, David and Surinder, for giving us the opportunity to introduce our cluster and the objectives that we have for the next 4 years. And I was very encouraged and very pleased with Patricia's talk, because I realized that we seem to have been started doing something well that is engaging with the industry and engaging with the public. Because AQUAWALES is basically a collaborative project between 3 Welsh universities. That includes as well the local government, it includes NGOs, and it includes end users of aquaculture. So we seem to have touched all of the stakeholders related to aquaculture in Wales. And when I was putting together this slide 2 days ago, and I was putting all the logos, I actually thought, wow, we are a lot of people. So the first thing I want to do is to introduce who we are and what do we do. And we have put together a really multidisciplinary team. So in Swansea University, the team is led by myself and Carlos García de Leániz, and we have managed to recruit 2 really exceptional people that are Olivier Ray, that is currently a postdoc in CNRS, and he will be joining us in the 1st of June. And then Chloe Robinson, that is sitting there, she just finished a master in environmental management at Swansea University. She actually won the first prize of her cohort for her marks. And our expertise is in evolutionary and conservation genetics, fish behavior and ecology, aquaculture, and invasive species. The Cardiff team is led by Joe Cable, that is sitting there, and it includes Pablo Orozco-Chedwengel and Amy Ellison, that is currently a postdoc in Cornell and will be joining us the 1st of June as well. And their expertise is on parasitology, fish disease and ecology, population genetics, and genomics and bioinformatics. And in Ovaries, we have the team is led by Joe Jackson, and he just interviewed last week PhD students. He has offered it to one of them, and he's waiting for the response. And their expertise is in wildlife immunology, population genomics, and disease and climate change. So we are joined by a number of collaborators, some of them working on the aquaculture sector, some of them are there behind Brendan, Gara, and Debbie sitting somewhere from Skillfest, Jack James from Pontus Aqua, Eric Roderick from Fusion, and Raquel Xavier from the Research Institute on Biodiversity and Genetic Resources in Portugal, that is investigating on-farm and wild disease interactions. Together, they have expertise in fish breeding, in genetic improvement for fish breeding. They also train companies in fish health, welfare, and they provide consultancy for aquaculture in both the sea, the marine environment, and freshwater. Some of our partners work on invasive species as well, on aquatic invasive species, and we are privileged to have on board Peter Goff and Tristan Hatton-Ellis from Natural Resources Wales and David Hall from the Cardiff Harbour Authority. They will be providing their expertise in environmental monitoring and management of invasive species as well as conservation. And then Stephen Marsh-Smith from the YNS Foundation and David Kilby from Natural Aptitude will be providing their expertise on citizen science in terms of the detection and control of invasive species. So all of this expertise, all of these diverse people, what are we going to do together? We are going to tackle a very timely problem. And I think this is a good introduction to it. So basically they say that if you give fish to a man, you feed him for 1 day. If you teach him how to catch fish, you feed him for life. But we seem to have overdone this over the last decades, and basically we have overfished most of the traditional fisheries. As a consequence of that, the aquaculture industry is increasing in importance. So I think this graph is very descriptive of how the capture fisheries in aquaculture has been growing over the last decade. So the demands for fish and shellfish have increased over 9% annually over the last 10 decades or so. And it's expected that by 2000, so this year actually, we will be consuming about 180 million tons of fish and shellfish. That's a lot. But most of it cannot come from wild, from captured fisheries, because most of them are already exhausted. And if you look at the graph, it's very clear that most of it is coming from aquaculture. So aquaculture is getting intensive, and this intensification has to be made sustainable. So basically, fish or shellfish have to thrive under less food, less water, less space, and all of this compounded by warmer temperatures, by climate change. How does this affect whales? Well, fisheries in Wales produce about 30 million per year, and is the basis of many rural and coastal economies. And one of the proposals of the government is to double the amount of aquaculture by 2020, sorry. So what are the main challenges faced by this intensification of aquaculture? Well, one is to reduce the ecological footprint. As I mentioned before, we need to make the fish able to live with less need of food, particularly wild food, and to live in using less water. But also the conditions of the fish farming mean crowding, and the crowding mean changes in the way the diseases are transmitted. So farm fish are more prone to disease, and they can act as reservoirs for diseases that can be transmitted to wild fish. So another challenge of aquaculture is to limit this risk of disease transmission. And finally, with the intensification of aquaculture, a lot of it is produced by diversifying species. And many of the species that we culture are alien species. They are not native from the place where we culture them. So there is a need to reduce the risk of introducing invasive species. Or if we introduce them, we need to control their escape to avoid ecological consequences. So we are tackling these challenges with in 3 different ways. So our first objective is to analyze the response of fish to crowding and stress, that are the main conditions found in farming. And this is because we want to tackle the problem in a different way. So instead of changing feeds or trying different antibiotics, we want to go to the basis of the problem. So how can we get fish better domesticated in a way that they need? They are more resistant to disease, they are more resistant to the conditions of farming. So we will do this by examining how different species respond to crowding, and what are the differences between wild and farm fish, because that will give us an idea of what domestication is causing in these individuals. And we will relate this to how parasites evolve in captive and wild conditions. The next thing is, what are the bases of what we are seeing? So what are the molecular bases of these changes? And for that, we will look at the relative roles of genetic and non-genetic effects, such maternal effects, for example, that are very important. And first thing, we will be looking at how these genetic and non-genetic effects affect the response of fish to stress and pathogens. And we will be doing that by looking at the gene expression and how the environment affects this gene expression. And the third objective is to monitor invasive species. So we want to look at which ones are the main sources of introduction related to fisheries and aquaculture, of invasive species, but not just looking at this, but looking at how they disperse, and to see whether we can model the dispersal of these species under different scenarios of climate change. How is climate change going to affect the presence of these invasive species in our environment, and how is going to affect their establishment and dispersal? So the way we approach this is we are going to use 3 species that are commercially important. Salmon and tilapia are the most widely farmed fish in the world, and we know quite a lot about their culture. Sea bass is a newest species introduced recently in the farming, and is a challenging one that has commercial importance in Wales as well. And then this is an example of some of the invasive species that we will be looking at. Some of them are introduced actually by aquaculture, like the Pacific oyster, that is still not invasive, but this seems to be expanding due to the warmer temperatures in the southern and the south of the UK. Some others are introduced through fishing or sportive angling, and they can cause problems to the industry. Like, for example, the zebra mussel is a big problem for many companies like waterways, for example, and the killer shrimp is a big problem in Cardiff Bay. So we will be looking at these species, and the research approach that we are taking is, in the case of domestication, we will be looking at how crowding and stress affect the morphology, the physiology, the behavior, and the resistance to parasites of fish. And what we think is really novel about our project is that we will be looking at differences in gene expression, but we will be looking at non-genetic differences. And this is something that is recognized in relation to domestication. So we know that epigenetic changes induced by the environment are related to domestication in birds, for example, or in mammals. There is, in the news, it's very common nowadays to read how the nutrition of the mothers affect their offspring and also their grandchildren, but we still didn't look at this in fish. So how does this crowding and this stress affect the successive generations of farm fish, and how does it going to affect to the production in the long term? So this is what we want to look at. And as well, in terms of invasive species, we are to apply novel methods such as environmental DNA to identify the origin of these invasive species and to look at their dispersal. And this is a very novel method that basically consists in taking water and looking at these species without having to capture them. So by looking at the DNA that they release in the water. So we will be using this method together with citizen science. So part of our team develop apps that citizens can use in their mobile to send information of when you find a particular species. You can take a picture and send the information to a database. We will be combining this citizen science with the novel environmental DNA to not only detect the invasive species, but also try to model how they disperse and how they will disperse under different scenarios of climate change. So I think that this defines a little bit the different objectives of our project. We want to thank the funders for giving us the opportunity to do this project that we think is really exciting. And thank you very much for listening. And any questions?